Hi, and welcome to this webinar on cosmetics today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We'll just give it a couple more seconds for people to join, but we will get started in a moment. The lovely Amanda Isom will be talking about the key principles of global cosmetic regulations. So I think we'll get started. Are you ready, Amanda?
I'm ready.
Yeah, Amanda's ready. Let's go. Okay, perfect. So welcome to this webinar. Just to briefly walk through some kind of, they're not rules, are they? But just some participation things to think about. So on the next slide, we just really want you to actively participate. So I can't wait to hear from Amanda. Amanda and I did a similar webinar. It was about 3-4 years ago now, with the lovely support of ICW. I've thoroughly enjoyed that one back then. So I'm super excited to hear this one and learn more about cosmetics. But Amanda and I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but this session is not for us, it's for you. So please do, this is your opportunity to ask as many questions as you like. We will try our best to do that. I will have lots anyway, if the group do not. So we'll definitely have some interaction and some questions throughout, but please do put your questions in the chat function. Hopefully it's working for you. Even if you just want to say hi and test it and make sure that it works for you, that would be great. Your lines should all be muted, so that should absolutely be fine. We will keep any queries confidential, so we won't highlight your name specifically, but welcome to some familiar names that we can see on there, and it's lovely to have you back again. This session will be recorded, which is great because you can review it later on. The ICW team will send you the information and you can access the recording as well. So in case there were bits that you miss or you want to share it with your colleagues afterwards, you can do that. So very, very briefly, in case you don't know who I am, I'm going to introduce myself really quickly, and then I'm going to pass over to Amanda, who's going to go through the rest of the slides. But my name is Geraldine Koch. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you here for this 45-minute webinar. So for the next 45 minutes, I'm a product safety expert. I'm based here in London in the UK. I've got coming up to nearly 20 years now experience in product safety and done lots and lots of training with many different participants, which I always learn from the training sessions as well. So I thoroughly enjoy doing training activities, as well as some other key activities I've worked on, such as the technical author for a number of PASs, which some of you might be familiar with. So 7055, which is on button and coin batteries, 7100, which is on corrective action and recalls, and 7050 on bringing safer products to market. If anyone has any questions about those, you can let me know and I will get in contact with you later on. Also worked with projects that were sponsored by the European Commission. A key one, which I think is really useful, is the Speak project. If you search for that in your internet browser, you will find lots of free training sessions as well on there for a number of different topics related to product safety, and that's available for all. So that's a little bit about me. I will pass over to Amanda now to go through the rest of the session. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a small apology because 4 o'clock in the afternoon here is where our local ice cream van comes around the roads. So I'm really sorry if you hear
Can you
that
get me one,
in the
please?
not too distant background every so often for about the next 15 minutes. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm Regulatory Affairs Director at Bloom Regulatory. I have 25 years experience in the cosmetic industry, and I was very fortunate to spend the first 2 decades of that at the Cosmetic, Toiletry and Perfumery Association in the UK, really getting to grips with industry and everything regulatory. I have co-edited the SCS and Royal Society of Chemistry book on discovering cosmetic science. So I was very fortunate to be involved in that project. And now I head the regulatory team at Bloom Regulatory. We are a small, bespoke boutique regulatory consultancy, but we do have a number of advisors on the team. So I head that team within the business.
I was just looking for my copy because I purchased that the other day. So I'm really interested in reading that. So I've got my copy.
It's almost Christmas time, so it's that time for everyone to put it on their Christmas lists.
Yes, that was my present to myself.
Yes, absolutely. So the agenda for today, we're going to have a brief introduction to international regulations. Then we're going to talk about some of the specific aspects that I want to highlight. So things relating to product design, so in particular the formula and the manufacturing practices, and then some other considerations that you should look into when looking perhaps outside your initial launch market. So classification, labeling, and registration and notification. Now we've popped a Q&A at the end, but I'm more than happy to take questions along the way. So Geraldine's going to keep an eye on the chat. So if you have a question relevant to the slide we're on at the time, do post it straight away and I can deal with it at that moment. And if not, we'll capture them at the end. Okay, so starting off then with the introduction to international regulations, I think the first thing I want to really highlight is wherever you are selling your product, it is likely that the local regulations apply. So even if you are only selling your product online, if you are targeting that consumer in that market, then you are going to need to comply with the local regulations. It's particularly useful to know in advance of designing your product where you want to go in the future. And I know that's a really difficult question to answer, and you're not going to always know every market you want to go to. But the more you know in advance, the more you can prepare, and the more the world is open to you once you are ready to launch. So for example, aspects such as formula, if you don't get that right up front, that is something obviously that's going to be really difficult to change if you want to send that to a different market later. So if you can design that in at the beginning, that's really going to help you to go internationally. And secondly, manufacturing practices, we'll look at a bit more of this later, but also it relates to who you choose to do your manufacture. It can close some markets to you if you don't get that right in advance too. So again, if you can know where you want to go, you can plan for that in advance. And then we're going to look at the things that maybe you can deal with afterwards and a bit further down the line, the classification of the product, the labeling, the registration and the notification. So things you can change a bit later. So if we consider formula at the beginning, I did say that I would use the EU often as a case study. I have got a couple of other things as we go through as well, but it's a really good gold standard of regulation. So it's an excellent one to use as an example anyway. But it really illustrates how we can have ingredient restrictions in place in a particular market, and how if you didn't know this in advance, then this could really stop you from coming to that market once you find out later on. So for example, we have 27 countries in the EU, and they all follow the same annexes of the cosmetics regulation. So Annex 2 is a list of prohibited substances, and we're talking sort of 1,600 odd substances that are prohibited. We've got Annex 3, which is a list of substances which are restricted. Now, essentially, anything that isn't on one of those two lists, you can use it, providing your product is safe. But if you've got a colour, a preservative, or a UV filter, we've got positive lists for those. So again, if you had used a colour that wasn't on Annex 4, then this market is going to be closed to you. So it's great to plan that into the design phase.
Ask a question there.
Sorry, go on. Yes, you can.
Just thinking here, and apologies if you're going to cover it later on, but I mean, I think people are kind of maybe a little bit over it now, or I'm a little bit over it now, but for the UK, is it generically speaking the same, or is it different, or is that a difficult question?
Is it the same? It's not the same. It is still
okay.
What we used to call retained law is obviously still in place. So we still have the overall framework that comes from what we took from the EU in 2020. The lists we took in 2020. So that's when it changes. Anything that's happened in the EU since doesn't automatically come to the UK. Now, most of them we have adopted by chance, but I think what you need to think of actually at the moment, usually if you're compliant in the EU, you're more than compliant in the UK, because we may be in a catch-up scenario, but there is always the possibility as we go forward that divergence will happen. So we have to, I think, going forward, think of the UK just the same as any other market like Canada or US. It's going to be different, and it has to be
worth
checked.
double checking, right?
absolutely. We now run formula checks as two separate territories because they're not the same anymore. Canada, again, we've got a list. It's not quite as many different lists as we've got in Europe, but there is a hot list, so prohibited and restricted substances, and that's quite an extensive list. It's quite similar to the EU when you do find something's prohibited or restricted, but not necessarily always the same. So you do need to watch out for that. And then the US has a very small list of prohibited substances at the moment, so most things can go to the US. But then when it comes to something like colours, where you've got a particular list that you're allowed to use, it can be far more restrictive than the lists that we've got in the EU. So you may need to consider from that angle rather than the EU. So it depends which direction you're going as well. If you happen to be US based and you're coming to the EU, that can be a huge challenge if you weren't using the EU annexes. If you're going the other way, it tends to be a little bit easier because at the moment you tend to be a bit more restricted in the EU. So the main challenges when we're looking across the different markets with the different annexes or prohibited lists, etc., is the difference in the colours permitted in the type of products that you might be marketing. So that is something to really watch out for. The US can be really quite prohibitive about the type of product a colour is going into. So for example, around the eye or on the lips can be far more prohibitive than in the EU. Preservatives in the EU are quite tightly controlled, so a specific list, but again, in other markets, that list can be even shorter. So that's something to watch out for. And a real challenge can be UV filters, in particular between the US and the EU, because the lists are not very harmonized at all. So if you start from an EU focus, you may be blocked to go to the US, most likely that way around. But trying to use UV filters across the world, you end up with quite a narrow palette of UV filters that you can use. So it's good to know all of your markets in advance, like I was saying. From a manufacturing perspective, there are some instances where your choice of manufacturer can be controlled by the requirements that you have to meet locally. So if you are needing to follow specific good manufacturing practices, obviously we'd probably expect that you're always manufacturing to GMP, but depending on the classification of your product, it may impact whether you need cosmetic GMP or pharmaceutical GMP. So of course, if you choose a cosmetic manufacturer and then you want to go somewhere where your product is going to be considered a drug, your GMP is not going to be suitable. And the US is one example of that, where your OTC, your over-the-counter, facility needs to be registered in order to manufacture the product. Under the US MOCRA, the new regulation, you will also need to register the facility as well for a cosmetic. So if you're choosing somewhere for either of these types of product that isn't registered, then there's a burden obviously that's falling onto you. So it's far better if you can choose someone that's already registered for the territory that you want to go, and you know they don't have to adapt their processes in any way, because that can also become quite costly for you if you're the only customer. So moving on then, in terms of things to watch out for once you've got a product already developed, the first one is the classification of your product, because this can vary across the world. You're not always going to be a cosmetic. There are primarily two types of definition for cosmetics. There is a broad definition. Well, this obviously, as the name suggests, it has a wide scope. It tends to be that we see that the safety of ingredients is controlled, and we have testing or documentary proof. So safety testing, or for example, in the EU, the Cosmetic Product Safety Report, the safety assessment. Those things tend to go hand in hand with a wide scope definition. For a narrow scope definition, these are often the markets where there's a third category of product. So you've got cosmetics and you've got drugs, but then you might have something in between that's a little bit more functional. And this is quite often why then the definition for the cosmetic is quite narrow, because obviously all in all, we've got three definitions covering the full spectrum of products that are out there. So as an example, the EU is a broad definition. This is the definition from the regulation. So we've got a substance or mixture intended to be placed in contact with the various external parts of the human body. And we have those parts listed. And it does also include the teeth and the mucous membranes of the oral cavity. And then we have the functional part with a view exclusively or mainly to clean, perfume, change the appearance, correct body odors, protect or keep in good condition. So that definition has three fundamental parts: the substance or mixture, the application area, and the listed functions. And you have to have all three of those for your product in order to be relevant. So if, for example, you have an article, so a hairbrush, you know, that kind of item, not a substance or mixture, then you've already had one part that's not relevant to you. So therefore you cannot be a cosmetic product. The same if you have a function. This is the most common one that you fail on. If your function is not one of those functions, then it cannot be a cosmetic product. So we do have quite a few functions there. It is quite a wide scope. It does include a lot of different types of product. Whereas if we look at the US as a narrow definition, we have the term articles, but it's not the same as we think of as an article in the EU. So it's not like a hard item. It can also be obviously substances and mixtures. Rubbed, poured, sprinkled or sprayed on, introduced into or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness or altering the appearance. So again, we've got the bit at the beginning: substance, article, mixture. We've got an application method on this one, which is slightly different. Human body though, and listed functions, but a much shorter list of functions than we had in the EU. So this one really is quite narrow because it is, and excuse the use of the word cosmetic, but it is quite a cosmetic set of things to think about. So when you make a change to anything, be that perhaps painting the wall in your home, and we think of that as a cosmetic change, it really does apply that way in the US, and you can think of it like that. Anything that's more functional, more drastic, is not going to be a cosmetic in the US. And then we've got the third one, the one that doesn't quite fit in the narrow or the broad. We've got ones that have that third category in place that we talked about, so that category in the middle. But they also have ingredient restrictions of specific lists as well, which is sort of from the EU model. So it's a little bit of the narrow and a little bit of the broad all put together. So for example, Japan and Canada are very much like this. So we have a functional cosmetic or a self-care drug type category. Now they have their specific terms, for example, OTC, so over the counter in the US, natural health product or non-prescription drug in Canada, and a quasi-drug in Japan. So before obviously you can take your product to one of these markets, you need to establish the definition you're under, because you can't automatically assume that because it was a cosmetic in one market, it's going to be a cosmetic somewhere else. So you have to first decide what your product is, and then of course you can comply with the right legislation. And obviously we're only talking about cosmetics today, but it might mean that you need to go look at the OTC or a quasi-drug or one of the other pieces of legislation.
We have a few questions, if it's okay.
Yeah, shall we?
Now.
Yeah.
So one of them I'm going to ask. I actually had to ask for a little bit more clarification, but maybe you'll understand it. So let me know if you want me to expand on it a bit. So the question is, how do you define targeting? So you mentioned targeting earlier on a particular market. The EU tends to apply quite a broad definition, which you've been talking about, that captures much of the businesses selling online.
Yeah, and I think most places would do the same. I think you will rarely find that it's black and white and truly defined. It's going to be an analysis and an interpretation. So it's going to be looking at a number of different factors. I know a key one in the past, especially in the EU, has been, are you marketing it in that local currency? And do you ship to that market? Because if you haven't closed your shipping and you are stating it in that currency, you are obviously expecting that that consumer is going to be able to buy your product. So those are key things to think about. If you want to try and avoid it, a good way to do it is to have individual websites that are for specific markets. So you have that domain name that is the French one, it is the German one, and then you've missed out the one that you didn't want to comply with, for example. Obviously, there will always be consumers who get around it in some way or another. But if you are making it easy through the mechanisms you put in place, it's going to be very hard to say you didn't target them.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for products in general, to be fair. So I hope that answered that question. Please do add more in the chat if you wanted more. And then one more question is, for foreign manufacturers that need to register their facilities, how do they need to register and who with? Is it the US FDA? For foreign OTC manufacturers, who do they need to register with? Is it different for OTC manufacturers? That's the question.
Both, yeah, for US, both will be with the FDA. The OTC system obviously has been going for a long time. It does exist. And if you just go on the FDA website, you'll find that quite easily. For cosmetics, if you do a search on MOCRA, MOCRA, and FDA, you'll probably find the most recent press release that came out a couple of days ago, because the system was supposed to be launched in October and it hasn't arrived yet. So we are expecting that anytime, because the deadlines are the end of the year.
Okay, well, I hope that answers that question too. And if not, put more in the chat. But thank you, Amanda.
Okay, so let's look at some examples of how that pans out. So we've got the simple one, just a soap, be that a bar of soap or a liquid soap. Across the example markets here, you can see we've got a broad, we've got a narrow, and we've got the other types of definitions are going across here, and we can see that that type of product is likely to be cosmetic everywhere. It's quite simple. It has that obvious function, a cleaning function. Same with the lipstick, we're just changing the appearance. We're very comfortable that as long as there are no other claims attached to that are going to change that scenario, it's going to be a cosmetic under each of those definitions. But when we start looking at the more functional products, so sunscreen, for example, EU is cosmetic, but we have that list of UV filters we must follow. USA, then, it can't be a cosmetic, it's too functional as such. So you have to follow the OTC monograph. Japan, it's still cosmetic, and Canada, it becomes a non-prescription drug. So you can see there's quite a mixture there of what you're going to have to follow and keep in mind. Acne, another one that tends everywhere, to be honest, not to be cosmetic, but it is one a lot of people make a mistake with. Spot products, whatever you want to call them, pimples, zits, any terminology, it's all the same thing. Unless you are cleaning the skin to help prevent the build-up of bacteria, then you are likely to be some kind of medicine, whether that be the middle category or a full-on medicinal product, because in the EU we've only got one or the other, so you can only go to the full-on medicinal category. Anti-caries toothpaste, bearing in mind that is anti-caries, not just bulk standard toothpaste. If you've got claims alongside it, still good to be cosmetic in the EU, but you're going to push over into one of the other categories in the other markets. And the same with antiperspirants. You might find that you tip over into one of the others. And also hair dye, but not so much so. It is mostly cosmetic, as you can see there. That's a bit of a snapshot. It's not guaranteed, because you've put other claims on there that I didn't put in that description, then you may impact what you've done with the product. Okay, so labeling. I get asked, I reckon, every week, can I do a global label? That would make life very easy, wouldn't it? But it's, in my view, it's not possible. Obviously, depending what your globe looks like and where you're going, it might be. But I would say, generally speaking, it's best to assume that you are not going to be doing a global label. You are some way or another going to be having to do something to that product to put it into a particular market. The main reasons being that you will need translations. As we just discussed, you may have a different classification. So that will mean that your label needs to look completely different in that market anyway. And where the information goes on your label may differ as well, depending on each regulatory framework that you're following. And my other question to you is, most markets don't require you to translate marketing text, but do you really want to send your product into a market on the shelf where the consumer can't read anything, all that brilliant text that you've been writing, all those fantastic claims that you have about your product and why someone should buy it? Do you really want to send it into a market without your consumer being able to read that because it's not in their own language? And I think if you look on the shelf, honestly, most products are fully translated for the market that they're in. But certainly we don't see much in the UK that isn't fully translated. In terms of the EU, as one example, we have a very specific list of what you have to put on the label. It doesn't so much matter where you put it in the EU. So a responsible person name and address, the function of the product, the content, be that the number of wipes or the grams or the milliliters, an ingredient list according to the glossary of EU names, precautions and warnings, period after opening or best before date if applicable, the batch code and the country of origin of the product. And keeping in mind, one of the key elements in the EU that has to be translated is the precautions and warnings. So if you've got quite a few of those on your product, you are probably going to need to have more than one label to cover 27 countries, because that's going to be an incredibly challenging scenario. If we come away from the EU for a second and we consider the US as another example, there are markets out there where what needs to go on your label and where it needs to go doesn't come from just the cosmetics legislation. So you may have another piece of legislation that you need to read alongside. And the US is one of these examples. We have the FD&C Act, which has some of the requirements for cosmetics, but we have the Fair Packaging and Labelling Act, which is generally for consumer goods, that will also define some of the other aspects of what and also where. OTC products differ completely, so you have to follow a completely different set of rules. But the main aspect about the US labelling that differs to the EU is the concept of principal display panel. As I said, for the EU, you can put the information absolutely anywhere on the pack. For the US, there are certain things that have to go on what we call the principal display panel, which is usually the front, but it is essentially the one that the consumer sees when the product is on the shelf. So the name of the product, the identity, there are a couple of specific warnings if those are involved and they go on, and the net quantity. So it's usually the name of the product and the net quantity that needs to be on the front. The rest of the information can go anywhere on the product. But if you're going somewhere like Canada, then putting a label on the underneath with the name and address is not allowed. The name and address has got to be further up. So you've got to find that solution that covers your markets.
We have a question about Canada. I may ask
Yeah.
you, seeing as you mentioned Canada. So for the Canadian non-prescription drugs, okay, so this is talking about drugs, I'm not really sure. So do they have to follow a monograph list or restriction?
I don't believe so. I can double check that if they want to let us know what the product type is. I don't personally cover non-prescription drugs in Canada, but I can double check. I know the natural health ones do have monographs, and I will double check whether there is one for that product.
Yeah, that's a very specific question. It's an anonymous attendee, but if they want to email, we'll have our emails at the end, right? You've got your email and my email, so feel free if you want to know more, then just send us an email and we'll try and help you with that one.
I can send you a link to where to find it, no problem. The other things to watch out for on labelling are aspects that probably you don't know sometimes as well when you're doing your label. So if you have to register your product in a local market, then you're not going to know its registration number. Of course, expiry date you probably will know, but obviously it's not going to go on the main body of your label printed in advance. You'll be inkjetting or whatever technology you use to add that on later. But most of the time, markets don't need those two pieces of information. It is specific markets that need it. So you will need to develop a solution for those markets when you get there. Sometimes it's country specific labels. Sometimes it's over labeling. It's often over labeling locally, because that enables you, of course, to put all of the language on there as much as you want then as well. Or regional labeling, trying to get away obviously from that global aspect and treating areas together, because you can often group countries. They're not necessarily geographically close. France and Canada both need French, and you can usually most of the time use the same French, not always, but most of the time. So you can consider aspects like that.
What about peel and read labels?
Yeah, most places will allow peel and read. You just need to be careful sometimes what's on the outer part or what's on the one that's actually joined at the bottom to the actual pack, because obviously they are vulnerable to being undone if they're in retail. If you're doing it e-commerce, it's not so bad because you haven't got people opening it and potentially closing it and ripping it off in the process of doing that. So there are some countries who are a bit more picky about what goes where, but generally speaking, it's an option. Registration and notification, significant differences in what that entails and what that means to actually enter a market. So in the EU, we have notification. A notification means that you are going to inform the market that you are going to place the product there, but you can go ahead without waiting for any approval. So you need to do it normally in advance. Some places allow you up to a certain number of weeks or months after you start marketing to do that, but you will not always hear anything in return. You might at best get a receipt to say that you have notified. So that's a post-marketing enforcement system. So everything that is done in terms of inspection is done after you've already started marketing the product. Registration and certification are pre-market approval systems. Certification is really rare, so I'll deal with that one first. It's where accredited companies will need to certify your product before you can place it on the market. That is not often used. The one that might be used more often is registration. It's more similar to having that third category or a drug, because you do need to wait for approval before you can place the product on the market. So that one is more common as an alternative to notification. So of course there are timelines involved with those as well, registration. So if you're wanting to enter a market, you need to give yourself enough time to complete that process before your launch date. So the EU is, as I said earlier, a gold standard in regulation when it comes to cosmetics. It's a fantastic set of rules. I personally think they're quite easy to understand. They're also reasonably flexible on some occasions. It's not too prescriptive. You are given the chance to be a little bit competitive as well. But there are 10 key aspects involved in that regulation, some of which we talked about today. So definition of a cosmetic, responsibility, so who takes responsibility, and specifically the responsible person, the term that we use. Safety of the product and ingredient restrictions, good manufacturing practices, having a product information file rather than physical testing, so your safety assessment, labeling rules, what you can and can't do about claiming on your product, notifying your product, keeping a record or reporting undesirable events that happen, so the adverse reactions, and then finally that we're a system of post-market surveillance. So those 10 are really the 10 aspects that I've ever found in any regulation. The EU has them all. Other places have a selection of. So the best thing you can do is often to sit down with that list and check whether you've checked whether each of the markets you're going to has rules for those aspects. And if you check those 10, it would be unlikely you've missed anything. That should really help guide you in that respect. Okay. Any more questions?
That's perfect. That's great. And I assume if you go to the cosmetics regulation, me personally, I get really bored reading legislation. But does the regulation, does it break it down? Does it have these 10 points within the regulation if you want to know more? Is there?
Actually, yeah, it is actually really good, because
Oh, good.
what they did in 2009 was what we call the recast of the regulation, chapter headings. So chapter headings, and each article has a heading. So Article 2 clearly says its definitions. Article 3 says its safety. Article 13 says its notification. So if you're looking for one specific thing, it's really well signposted. Yeah, very good.
Perfect. I love that. That's great. Okay. I'm just going to ask a few questions. So, is it possible to have then a label for the whole of the EU? You mentioned about language, right? But is it possible? Have you seen it where you
Yeah,
have a label?
potentially. Challenging, I'd say, on small products, but on larger ones, yes. Because most of the time, if you've got a product that has no warnings, the likely piece of information that you need to translate for most of those countries is just the function. So let's say it's a shampoo. So
Yeah.
that word shampoo needs to appear in all of the languages. With 27 countries, I think it was something like 22 languages. So you would potentially have quite a long list saying shampoo, but that would all it would need to say. And then there's a handful, I'm going to say roughly 4 or 5, that require everything to be translated. So if you keep everything minimal and you don't really have marketing text either on your product, because all your marketing is done online, it's done through social media, etc., or maybe you don't even sell in retail, then you could probably fit that on that extra information.
And do you think it's possible to have a global formula? So one formula that works for every single market?
I'd say it depends on the product. Yeah, if you're going to have something with UV filters in, I think you're going to struggle. If you've got an uncolored product as well, that will be easier. If you can eliminate those kind of lists, then it's more possible, I would say.
Right. And is there useful any guidance document on the translation? So I'm thinking of toys and kind of non-cosmetic areas that I'm more familiar with. And there is a document that's published, I think, by the EU that translate every toy warning into the member
I see,
states.
yeah,
Is there
no,
anything similar for cosmetics or?
we've got a mixture of warnings that go on ours. I'm sure you must have similar. So we've got the ones that come from the legislation,
Right.
and then you've got the ones that the safety assessor is recommending that are needed in order to make sure that it may sometimes be directions for use. It depends what the product is. So those
tricky.
you're going to have to get someone to translate it. The ones that come in the legislation, if you go to the European Commission website, they're not all in one document. But if you were to open the French version of the regulation, knowing that the warning is in column, sorry, I can't remember which column it is, but column H of number 33 in Annex 3, then you can read your way through any of the languages to find that warning. And there it is for you.
That's a great piece of advice. Yeah, I like that. So a question that's come through is, are there any revisions to the EU regs on the horizon? So especially noting all the new digital passporting requirements that are being incorporated into various EU legislation.
There's a lot on the horizon, way too much to cover in one answer to one question. The EU cosmetics regulation is under scope of the EU Green Deal, and it is within scope of the chemical strategy. So that's the main place that changes will come from. We are expecting literally any time now the proposal for an amendment to the cosmetics regulation text, not to the annexes, to the actual text. So there could be some changes really coming out in draft, because we won't expect them to take effect for another 4 or 5 years, but they'll be out in draft potentially in the next few weeks, ready for adoption in 2025. But we've also got some recent things, so things like extra fragrance allergen labelling, that's already out. And of course, cosmetic regulation does restrict ingredients in cosmetics, but it's only from a human safety perspective. So we have to look at EU REACH, and we have to remember to look at EU REACH or UK reach if you're in the UK, for any restrictions that apply from an environmental perspective. So the microplastics is just published.
Yeah.
So we have restrictions and phase out on microplastics. And I don't just mean microbeads, I mean solid polymers they're called, but they will be film formers in some products, those type of ingredients. And also D4, D5, D6 cyclosiloxanes. Those restrictions come from REACH as well, not from the cosmetics regulation, because they are environmentally persistent, not a problem for human safety.
It's a challenge for all product safety, and I wish I could just say the term that you just said as elegantly as you just said it. That's what... But yeah, this is a challenge for everyone. Chemical compliance is yeah, it's huge, right, on all the products, and it's always going to keep us busy. You know, those of us that work in this industry, we are always going to be busy because things are always changing, and you have to keep an eye on it. So that's why it's great to have friends like Amanda and lots of other experts on board that you can ask questions to. So thank you so much. We have literally run out of time, so we could talk about this for ages. And I'm going to be reading your book and probably asking you a lot more questions. So if you put any questions in and we didn't have a chance to answer them, we will get in contact with you, I promise. I've noted those down. And what I want to ask you really quickly, it's been absolutely amazing spending time with Amanda again, and I love hearing about cosmetics. So, but is there anything else? Because this is actually our last webinar from ICW for this year. So it's been an amazing webinar. It's been an amazing webinar. It has. It's been an amazing year where we've covered, you know, the GPSR, risk assessment. We've covered some really great topics. So what would you like us to cover in 2024? So if you can scan the Menti code, hopefully it's clear enough. All you need to do is get your phone out and your camera and you just hover it over and it should work. I'm going to try now, do a little demonstration and make sure that it is. And then I'll be able to keep an eye on that and see if you can, yeah, let us know. And then we'll try our best to make your dreams come true with any webinars for 2024. We'll probably need another one on cosmetics at some point soon because things are changing so quickly. So please do let us know in the Menti. Also, very, very quickly, the ICW system, just to walk through that very quickly, there's been some new technology that's been adapted by the amazing ICW team. So I'm always so grateful and thankful to the amazing ICW team that put on these webinars for you. They're recorded, which I love as well, because I've referred to ones I've done earlier this year back to people that ask questions, and it's so useful to have that available online. But if you want help with your, fundamentally to take the headache out of the admin side of product compliance and product safety, that's what the ICW team does. And it uses data, which I absolutely love data. So we can use our data more intelligently and find out where we need to focus on in terms of testing and inspection and saving you money and time, which is what everyone needs to do. So just very quickly on the next slide, and then we have our last slide, is the overall QMAS system. So looking at all of your assessments on an overall view, there's various packages and programs that you can have that are bespoke to you. But if anyone's got any questions, you can contact myself or contact the great ICW team. On the next slide, I believe we have my email and Amanda's email. And people have put through the Menti. So people actually wanted to have a webinar on MOCRA. I wanted to ask you what that stood for. Am I saying that right, MOCRA?
You're testing me now, aren't you? Modernisation of cosmetic regulations, something like that.
Sounds great. I believe you anyway. We could say anything now and I believe you, whatever that is. So, wow, okay. A webinar on that, on probiotics, on CPSR, horizon scanning, medical devices. So, wow, we've got a lot deep dive into cosmetics, the PIF. So actually having a deep dive. So there's a lot of food for thought there for us to think about in 2024. But yeah, if you have any questions, please do let us know. Our email's on there. And if you so Amanda's email's not on this slide, actually, apologies. But if you email me, I will definitely put you in contact with Amanda. And for the questions that you've asked that we haven't had a chance to get to, I will make sure that I email you and get Amanda to answer those for you. But once again, thank you so much, Amanda. It's always a joy and a pleasure spending time with you. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar and for your time. And hopefully see you all soon. Thanks, Amanda.